We are so excited to have everyone today. I think this is probably the third or fourth honest conversations that I've hosted with Darkness Delight, and they just get better and better. So I'm thrilled today to be talking with a group of incredibly knowledgeable and experienced individuals from the Orthodox Jewish community. It's incredibly important to know, we hear a lot about religions and the Catholic religion, Baptists, Southern Baptists, and how they're dealing with struggles, both in the hierarchy of the church, but also in the community, and understanding and accepting that child sexual abuse does in fact happen in their community. And this is no different than what we find in the Orthodox Jewish community. Everyone is learning and everyone's moving to a place where we're able to understand and better protect children. And so I'm thrilled today to have three amazing guests. We have Debbie Fox from the Child Safety Institute. We have Rochel Bernstein, who is the founder of Child Safety Pledge and a Darkness Delight board member. And we have Rabbi Zippel, who is the head of a school, a parent, and a survivor. So I would love to start with you, Rabbi. If you could give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself, where you work, why this topic is important to you. We'd love to hear a little bit more.
Well, thank you, Katelyn, and thanks to Darkness Delight for hosting this incredibly important conversation. Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. We're in that tricky time between time zones. My name is Rabbi Avremi Zippel. I am a rabbi in Salt Lake City, Utah. As Katelyn mentioned, I come to this conversation from a number of different places. I myself am a survivor of child sexual abuse. I was abused over a decade by our childhood babysitter, and over the past few years, I made the decision to get help, to seek therapy. I ended up prosecuting my abuser. I went through the justice system, and now I am thankfully on the other side of the issue. I am a parent to two little boys who I'm obviously very passionate about protecting them from what I have gone through. I run a school here in Salt Lake City, and so coming to this issue in terms of keeping our students safe and creating a safe structure for kids who are in our institution is vitally important to me, and I am looking forward to a great conversation.
Rochel, where are you calling from today?
From my home in Los Angeles, California.
Very nice. Tell us a little bit more about Child Safety Pledge.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here with Debbie and Avremi as well. So I'm also a survivor of child sexual abuse, and I didn't come out with my story for about 30 years. So it was something that I was aware of my whole life and kind of kept for a very, very long time as this deep-seated secret. And I founded Child Safety Pledge when my youngest was a baby. My mother suddenly passed away, and I think I was faced with this question of how I was going to address, I think, mortality and impact. Founded Child Safety Pledge to really address the issue from a parent perspective, help parents learn about child sexual abuse prevention, how to talk to their kids, how to normalize conversations in communities, and also work with philanthropists and corporations on child sexual abuse prevention and advocacy.
That's amazing. I can't wait to hear more about the parent approach that Child Safety Pledge has been utilizing. And finally, but not least, Debbie Fox, tell us more.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and I've always had so much admiration from Darkness to Light. I watch your website, watch the things that you do for years, and it's really, really a pleasure. Rochel and I have worked together in the past, and that's really been wonderful. So it's wonderful to be on the panel with you, and really nice to meet you, Rabbi Zippel. But I'm a clinical social worker. I have a private practice, and I founded an organization within the Jewish community called the Child Safety Institute, or Magen Yeladim, which means in Hebrew, protecting children. As part of that, our main kind of flagship program is called the Safety Kit program. And that's a program that goes into communities all over the United States, Canada, Mexico, and even Belgium, where the approach that we use is creating safe communities, and where we train school administration, staff, parents, and then go into children. And the goal is to create safe communities within this approach. We've also developed a program for safe camps and for girls going to high school and those kinds of things. There are other additional programs. And I've also done a lot of trainings for Child Protective Services and other agencies like that on cultural sensitivity and working with the Orthodox community.
My goodness, I can't wait to hear more about that as well. Thank you so much each for introducing yourself. I just want to go back now that we've had a number of people join us. Thank you so much. We have a very international crowd today. We have people from Panama, we've got some people from India and Brazil. We're so thrilled and honored to be able to share this information with you all. There's a few housekeeping things that I want to talk about just before we move on to the meat of today's conversation. All participants are muted. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature and we'll try and get to your questions towards the end of the conversation today. And this chat is for networking and comments. So introduce yourself, continue to tell everyone where you're from. Make sure that you're asking, commenting. We love to hear your reactions to the things that we're saying. I know I will read them and comment while we're chatting. So please feel free to say hi to everyone and introduce yourself and where you're from. And also, the reality of this type of conversation is that it can be triggering for some people. We want you to know that this is a safe place and that there are free resources here in the United States. If you need to talk to someone, we want you to call 1-866-4-LIGHT or text the word LIGHT to 741-741. So again, you can call the hotline for free in the US, 1-866-4-LIGHT. Or you can text the word LIGHT to 741-741, and that's the crisis text line. So you'll be able to chat with anyone that you need in order to be able to process through today's conversation. All right, thank you again so much for each of your backgrounds. Rabbi, I'm gonna start off with you. What are a few things that you think people who are not part of the Orthodox Jewish community should understand about the community in general as it relates to this conversation of child sexual abuse prevention?
I think the greatest misconception that exists on a global level about the Orthodox Jewish community, understanding that by and large, the Orthodox Jewish community is not super geographically diverse. I mean, for the most part, they're pretty much cordoned off into neighborhoods on the East Coast and Israel and throughout Europe, and it's easy to look at them as or look at us, I should say, as others and kind of folks who live on an island. But I think the most important premise of the conversation is that the Orthodox Jewish community is like any other group of people in the entire world. We have our struggles, we have the things that we're working on, we have the things that we acknowledge are important. And I think that as a society, we are moving along and identifying threats to our community, things that we need to do to be keeping ourselves and our children and our future safe. And one of those is childhood sexual abuse. I think that within the Orthodox community, there might still be powers that be that might think that this is an issue that does not affect our community. Childhood sexual abuse is this very wise disease that knows how to skip certain groups of people. And I think that being within the community, we know that not to be true. We know that we are affected by this issue as much as any other group of people. I wouldn't say more specifically than any other group of people. I think it's, we're regular folks just like anybody else. And, this issue affects us just as it does any other community of people. I think that like most religious communities, we are still in the earlier phases of gaining awareness and empowering through education, teaching our teachers, teaching our parents, teaching our children how to have difficult conversations. I think that the taboo around the issue has existed for a very long time, continues to exist, but it's definitely something where I think we see remarkable continued improvement literally on a daily basis. And I think that in that sense, I know it's easy sometimes to pigeonhole and talk about issues within a specific community, but in a very general sense, I'd say that the Orthodox Jewish community is like everybody else on a certain level. The issue affects us. We're doing the best that we can to continue to empower through education and bring prevention into every possible facet of our lives. And that will be a continuous struggle, which we'll keep on doing every single day until we succeeded to make real change in this issue. And that's going to be a fight for every single day.
Such great points. And truly, if you watched our prior honest conversation that I hosted, we talked to the Hispanic and Latinx community, and they said very similar things. very religious communities, very family oriented, very tight knit. And there is a deep desire not to break that family bond and that community bond. And if that means holding on to secrets, then people will do so in order to maintain that community. And so it sounds like what you're saying is you identify with some of those things, that close-knit community and that family.
I would add, I'm here in Salt Lake City. I don't live in a large Orthodox Jewish community. In fact, I'm one of the 8 Orthodox Jews here in this state, but I live in a very large religious community.
Right.
Obviously, Utah is predominantly religious, with this being the seat of the LDS Church. And I have had so many conversations with members of the clergy, with mental health professionals, with child advocates who work within the Mormon Church. And when we talk about it, we realize how similarly the issues line up, because you're going to find the dynamics being the same in every cluster of people. In all of those tight-knit groups, you have the concern about rocking the boat. You have that stigma about tearing apart the community and it's all going to be your fault. And the similarities really, really strike me.
Completely. Rochel, you also grew up in the Orthodox Jewish community. Was child sexual abuse discussed in your family, at school, at your synagogue? Talk about what it was like to grow up, and did you hear about any of those things?
So I grew up in New York and went to very traditionally Orthodox schools. And I would say not only was it not discussed, but there was no sex ed. There was no real conversation about our bodies, about how they worked. I remember becoming a bat mitzvah when I was 12, and there was lots of conversation about spirituality and about what it was to become a Jewish woman and, Jewish matriarchs, but there was no conversation about puberty, about, the female body, how that worked. There were no conversations about, attraction and what could happen if one was in a situation with someone of the opposite or the same gender, and there was any sort of power dynamic. There was really nothing that was discussed, and sex was sort of viewed, I think, as something that was reserved for marriage, and there was a lot of shame surrounding any conversations about sexuality. And I don't know if that was just unique to my upbringing, but I think that, from peers that I've spoken to from across the Orthodox Jewish spectrum, it's not uncommon for there to be a lot of secrecy around conversations regarding sexuality or child sexual abuse. And I would really agree with that concept that there's this fear of ripping a family or a community apart if something does happen. And often I think victims carry a lot of that shame, a lot of that fear that, if they do come out, I know I felt that way, that I was going to be, facing that stigma and that added shame.
Yeah, that stigma is a heavy burden no matter what community you're in, but certainly in a community that doesn't necessarily have open conversations about sex and sexuality in general. Which then brings me to you, Debbie. You have spent the majority of your life talking to communities, institutions, organizations, parents about child sexual abuse. So can you speak to what some of the additional stigmas are in the Orthodox Jewish community, and what are some of the most common conversations you end up having with parents in particular?
I think they really brought up, between Rabbi Zippel and Rochel, they brought up what the stigmas really entail, which is that sexuality has always been something very private within the Orthodox community. I know that I've worked in lots of different agencies and communities where women come in and talk about their sex life all the time. In the Orthodox community, it's considered very private. It's not a public discussion, right? It's not a public discussion. So there are things that are considered private. But I think Rochel is right, especially years ago, anything related to sexuality. And in those days, I didn't get any more from my mother than you got from yours, and you're quite a bit younger than me. But, other than a box of pads, I didn't get any more discussion either. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, today, what I will say is that there's some wonderful books written for girls within the community that very, very often are given to girls, and mothers are encouraged to discuss it with them. So whereas I think that concept that Rochel brought up before is language, moms don't have that language. So when that language is given to them with a book and they can discuss it, it has become something that I think is utilized more. When I meet with parents, I would say my major emphasis is the concept of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's empowering parents to have those conversations, to be that parent that children can go to and can talk about things, and giving parents the responsibility of opening the conversations and educating their children, because children certainly aren't going to be the ones to open it if their parent seems too uncomfortable to bring it up to them.
Right.
So it's about using what I call windows of opportunity and what if experiences, just natural windows of opportunity. Children in a bath identifying their private parts. And as I give the conversation smack in the front of these Orthodox communities where the words penis and vagina are not used publicly,
Mm-hmm.
right? We do use the word penis and vagina. We have a video clip of Dr. Ronnie Nagel teaching parents how to use the words penis and vagina with a child, so that, and we stress the importance of that for the child. But the more naturally you do it when they're little and in a bath, then the easier it is as they get older. And people's fear is that their 3-year-old is going to run around to every Orthodox school saying penis, 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 you know, and then their kid's going to be kicked out of school. And what they learn is when it's natural, the kids don't walk around saying it 20 times a day in school and get kicked out. Right?
Exactly.
So it's about natural conversations and training them on their responsibility to have natural conversations.
I think that's such a great point. And it's so funny that you bring up the bath instance, only because at Darkness to Light staff meeting this week, our operations manager brought up that her son was in the bath. He's probably about 2 years old. And she was sort of saying to herself, okay, this is a teaching moment. He had his toys sort of down near his penis and he was exploring. And she expressed on staff meeting even how nervous she was that she had to start having these conversations, and was she going to say it right, and was she going to scar him for life because she was starting to teach him, about his penis. So even someone that works at Darkness to Light, that talks about this every day, that thinks through these problems and is 100% behind all of these prevention education initiatives that we all talk about, still is nervous in the comfort of her own home with her own child, being able to have this conversation. And the beauty of her telling that story and being vulnerable was that we all got to support her and say, we get it, it's awkward, we understand. And she didn't feel so alone in that conversation. And I think that, Debbie, what you're doing out there is exactly that, trying to build that community and strengthen that community of language amongst parents in order to be able to have the courage to have those conversations, not just with your children, but then sort of talk, with your people about how awkward and uncomfortable it can be, learning how to be more open and honest about that. I love that. The connections between communities just makes me so happy. So, Rabbi, back to you. I want to talk a little bit about your disclosure. So at the time of your disclosure, you were the first Orthodox rabbi to come forward publicly about being sexually abused. Can you talk a little bit about the pressures and stigma surrounding this, one as a male, but also as a deeply respected authority figure within your community, and how that process has sort of gone for you?
Sure. So I think you hit the nail right on the head, Katelyn. I mean, in the months leading up to making the decision to come forward publicly, there were a lot of reasons not to do it. There weren't a whole lot of reasons to do it. First of all, so I came forward publicly in February of 2019. This was on the heels, or one would even say in the heat of the Me Too movement, and people speaking out about their experiences has become socially acceptable, and it's this remarkable grassroots movement, and it's amazing, and it really, really, really is. And I remember every couple of days going on social media and waiting for a guy to speak out about it, and waiting for that story that I could connect to of another male survivor. And I remember there was a time where I was really getting frustrated There were a number, even here locally in Utah or in the region, there were a number of situations where, there were teachers in high schools who were being, charged with being sexually inappropriate with a student. And when it was a male teacher and the victim was a young woman, there was this collective outrage, of how heinous the crime is. And when it would be a female teacher and a male victim, all of the chatter is all, kind of this snickering and giggling, about, well, whatever. And being a male survivor of sexual abuse with my abuser being a woman, that frustrated me because, it almost kind of spoke to the issue that, sexual abuse happens to young women, and for guys, it's just whatever. It's kind of a strange scenario that we don't really talk about. Compound to that I was an Orthodox rabbi, I am an Orthodox rabbi, and, I lived in a community where there was still that sentiment that was, either said or believed that these issues don't exist in our community. And I remember there was one very powerful moment, this was right in the heat of it, and I really needed to make a decision which way to go. I sat down one night and I took out my laptop and I Googled male Orthodox Jewish survivor of sexual abuse. I figured, let me find one guy. The internet knows everything. Surely they'll find someone for me that I can talk to that has walked down a similar path. And after 5 minutes, it became quite clear to me that Google didn't really know of anybody. And, if Google doesn't know of anybody, then, it's fair to say that they don't really exist on the internet. And I remember that episode being somewhat depressing, but it was oddly empowering in a certain sense, because once I got over the sadness, I remember thinking to myself, I'm pretty sure I'm not the only guy in my situation who's gone through this. And I know right now how much I would crave to speak to somebody else who's been down that path. And so maybe instead of, just getting all down in the dumps about how alone I feel in my situation, maybe the situation has presented itself to me for me to be that person for somebody else. And, it was really kind of that thought process that really gave me the urge to go forward and to fight the stigma. I mean, there was a lot of unknowns about that process. And ultimately looking back, I could say that it was, absolutely the best thing that I ever did. And it was, I've had the ability to help so many people through that. But it was, in the moment, it was a tough call. There was definitely a general feeling of loneliness that I think every survivor of childhood sexual abuse goes through, really, really compounded in that moment. I just want, if I may, for a second, jump back to something, because, Rochel, I mentioned this earlier, and it's an episode that happened. It's so fresh in my mind. It's not really connected to this conversation, but, Rochel and I had both mentioned the idea that, in our communities, there's really the sentiment of, a child being concerned about tearing apart a family or ripping apart a community. And this is something which I'm so passionate about. I had this really eye-opening moment with the prosecutor that worked my case, and it really, inspired me to speak out about this issue. And this does not just exist in the Orthodox Jewish community. This is a global issue. My abuser was charged with 7 felonies. And as, it moved through the trial process, it became quite clear that if she were to be convicted, she would be going to jail for a very, very, very long time. I'll jump to the end of the story. She's doing 25 to life right now. And there was a point in the trial process where, they shared this information with me, and I sat down and I felt kind of bad. My abuser is not a young woman anymore at this point. And I said out loud to the prosecutor, I feel bad to send an old woman to jail for that long. And my prosecutor is an experienced sex crimes prosecutor, and she looked me dead in the eye. I'll never forget what she said to me. She says, "You are not sending anybody to prison. Your abuser's actions are sending her to prison. I'm calling you as a witness to prove the case, but this is not on you. These are not your actions that is impacting anybody else's life. Your abuser needs to answer for her own actions." And I feel like it's a sentiment that survivors deal with so much. Do you want to ruin your abuser's life? Do you really want to do that to your rapist? I'm not doing anything to my abuser. I'm not doing anything to the person that did these actions to me. These were their actions, which they need to figure out what the consequences are for these actions. And so, especially when we speak to children and we share with them that sentiment of, well, is it worth it for you to tear apart a family? The child is not tearing apart a family. When this person made the decision to commit these actions years ago, it was those actions that would one day tear apart their family, and not the child coming forward later. And so just because it was mentioned, it's something which I'm particularly passionate about. I just wanted to bring that up.
I think it's an incredible point. I mean, Darkness to Light talks often about, when a child discloses, what are the first things you say? The first thing you say is, I believe you. And the second thing you say is, it's not your fault, right? And I think you're right, Rabbi, when survivors deal with the guilt at different levels of their journey into survivorship. And that starts with, did I ask for it? And moves through to, if survivors are lucky enough to go through the legal process, am I going to put someone away, for life? And I think that perspective and sort of flipping it on its head is an incredibly healthy way to talk about that. Sure. Debbie, you were nodding your head quite a bit. Did you have something you wanted to add?
I did, thank you. Didn't notice it, but thank you. Part of what I do, and I think, Rabbi Zippel, this might mean something to you in hearing what you're saying, is when I do a training with parents, I ask the question, why don't children tell? If children would tell, wouldn't your parents have done something if you had told them 10 years, during what was going on? But why don't we tell? And we go into all the reasons that children don't tell. They may be afraid of the abuser, they may have been groomed by the abuser, and they may love or respect the abuser. They may have both feelings. They may not have language to tell you. They may not think you can handle it, all of that. And then I say that the number one reason children don't tell is because they're afraid they will not be believed. That's the number one reason. But within our community, I always say there's another reason. And that's that they are afraid that if they tell, and even if you do believe and do something about it, they are afraid that the family will be cut out, stigmatized by the rest of the community. And because of their fear of how the community will respond, the child doesn't tell, or the family will do nothing about it. And I say, it's your responsibility, now that we understand sexual abuse, and now that we understand the impact of sexual abuse on children and on their families, it's your responsibility to stand for children and not predators.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Go ahead, Rochel.
Love how you can see what I'm thinking. Debbie, I couldn't agree with you more about the responsibility that we all have to stand for our children. I guess I would add two things. One is, as you know, Avremi, I think your very, very brave disclosure, I think has created a sort of current of support for survivors coming forward in the community, men and women. And something that I've noticed, is once I came forward, and I'm sure you've had this experience, I've handled so many disclosures from people who have survived abuse, many of whom are much older than I am, who come from a generation where it was so unacceptable for them to talk about their pain, about, the abuse that they had suffered. Many of them are parents, grandparents, and are concerned, obviously, about that added layer of responsibility that might tear apart families. And I just think that, we've been talking about that a lot in this conversation. It's something that is very real. I know of several situations where families have been torn apart and family members don't speak, or where survivors are not believed. And I think that really looking to create support for that in the community, and community leaders really creating that space and that safe haven is something that would be really incredible. And like you said, Avremi, it's not just in the Jewish community, it's a global issue. And I think that in terms of, creating strong communities, parents having those conversations, not just with their children, but with their peers, their schools, their synagogues, their community centers, is something that we're very, very much needing. And I know that I spent years trying to do that locally here in Los Angeles and actually all over the world. And it was interesting because I welcome in curriculums like the one that Debbie has with Safety Kid, and who are looking for resources. And there is still that fear, that very real sort of reticence and also fear to engage on the issue. So I'm wondering if either of you or Katelyn, what your take is on that, how we create more of that receptive culture that is standing for our children, and less of that, reticence to act.
Debbie, when we were sort of initially talking about doing this honest conversation, you brought up a few really amazing examples of work that you had done in communities who were starting to make headway. I'd love to hear more about some of the communities that you've worked with that have made really great decisions, even in difficult times.
So I've had incredible experiences, and maybe because when I come in and I present all of this, where we always train school administrators, and sometimes it's all the Orthodox schools in the city. The administrators get together and the staff gets together, and then we do one major parent workshop or 2 parent workshops or that kind of thing. And then we go to the kids after all that. I think because it's so discussed within the entire community, and the model that I utilize is, it takes a community to protect one child. It also takes a community that allows abuse. Mm-hmm. And that's the model I use. And I have found communities very receptive. I have found them very receptive. And for communities that will make room and space for it, we do a rabbinic training for what is the role of a rabbi in a community rabbi when it comes to abuse. So I'm finding when we work with entire communities, they actually have been very receptive. What I'm loving about it is the amount of calls that I get that involve what I call the little things. I prefer to be called from an administrator saying, you know what, I'm just somewhat uncomfortable with this teacher's relationship with this student. Let me tell you, like, for instance, I'll give you a little bit of an example. One rabbi called me from, I think it was Philadelphia. And one of the things he said is that after prayers every day, there's one rabbi who's been in the school for 10 years and everybody loves him, good guy. And he shakes everybody's hand every morning and he says, have a good day. And he's done it for years and there's never been a problem and he doesn't suspect a problem with it. But there's one boy, he noticed that every morning he put his hand on his cheek and he said, have a good day. And he'd never seen him do it. And he looked and looked and looked. And every day it was that one child. Everybody else just got a handshake. Mm-hmm. So he calls me up. Should I be concerned? I love the question. Mm-hmm. And I said, did you ask him about it? It turns out he did ask him about it. And this little boy lived in the house next door to the rabbi. And the little boy's father had just been diagnosed with cancer. And the rabbi's heart went out to him, but it could have been something different. And he could have noted it. And I think the fact that people are paying attention to smaller things and asking questions, it prevents the bigger things. Mm-hmm. And I am finding personally that more and more schools, they are doing what they need to do to prevent it. We have a conduct policy in Yiddish mm-hmm. that is in probably over 30 schools that only speak Yiddish. Mm-hmm. So people want help. Am I going to say that in every situation it is dealt with positively? I wouldn't say that. Mm-hmm. But I would say that people I'm finding want to do the right thing. I very often will say to people, you need to send them. It is not your job to determine innocence or guilt. Right. If you don't know, you need to send them to a forensic expert who can tell you what their profile is. You can't do it. You're a rabbi. You do rabbi stuff, you send them to an expert. And I'm going to tell you that I have sent more people, probably 40 or 50 people, to have full evaluations, offender evaluations. And everywhere I go, people will do it. They don't want the liability, which is the point I stress, mm-hmm. but they also are more aware.
Yeah, we know that those who are seeking to harm children are rule breakers. And so having codes of conduct and abiding by those codes of conduct allow administrators and managers the opportunity to be able to hold people accountable to a very clear and deliberate set of rules. And so it becomes less of an accusation and more of a, you've broken the code of conduct rule. And so we need to have a conversation about that. Mm-hmm. And I think I called them standard operating behaviors. You know, these are things that we expect of people now, such as handshaking. You know, hugs can be incredibly overwhelming for some people. So forcing hugs on people is not not a positive experience. Handshaking, I'm sure many of you have seen opportunities where the teachers are high-fiving or, doing a fist bump or, or they ask for a hug. I mean, those are ways of teaching kids consent very early and allowing them to choose how they want to interact with an adult. So that's a beautiful example. I love that.
Katelyn, if I may jump in for a moment. I know that, and Debbie, it's wonderful that you have so many communities and schools that are responding so positively. I find that in the Jewish Orthodox community and in other communities that have a private camp and a private school system, one of the challenges that I know I've encountered is establishing those codes of conduct in a sort of uniform manner. I remember attending a conference years ago and speaking. It was for a group of community centers, and someone raised their hand. She was directing one, and she said, well, at our center, we have all of these protection practices in place. We have a special room for kids to have their diapers changed, and it's a soundproof room, and there's always an adult in the room. And I kind of stood there looking at her, wasn't sure exactly how to tell her that having a soundproof room where children are vulnerable and undressed and only having one adult in the room was actually the complete opposite of the code of conduct that she should have been operating with. But because the way that these community centers and schools and camps are set up is that they're each individually run so often, I find that that's a challenge that we face, in our community. And I think it's the same in other communities. I'm sure that, Avremi, it's something that the Mormon community faces, the Catholic community, where there's such a, individualized system of schools and camps and centers. And, I'm hoping that we can try and really change that so that uniform codes of conduct, like things, teachers giving students gifts or giving them rides home, teachers texting with students, things like that are just something that, are not done in any of our schools or camps.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. And I think that for a lot of heads of organizations, no one wants to reinvent the wheel. And so when anyone who's running an organization wants to do something, they want to do it properly and they want to do it comprehensively, and they're at a loss. There's so much to tackle. Where do I start and who do I talk to? And I think that so many heads of organizations don't realize that the easiest thing for you to do is to adopt a uniform code of conduct. There are so many good organizations out there that have done such good work and such smart common sense work, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to come up with all of this on your own. There are, remarkable standards out there that you can and should adopt, which beyond doing this, the safest thing for your kids, you're doing the best thing for yourself in being able to tap into these incredible resources.
Mm-hmm. So I want to move to answering community questions. A reminder to everyone, if you have questions, please make sure that you are typing them into the Q&A or on Facebook in the comment section. My team is helping sort through all those questions. Before we move to that though, I want to talk a little bit about something that's a bit higher level than sort of community-based prevention. Rochel, one of the things that you and I have talked about for a long time is ethical investing. We see it in the environmental space, and we see it with movements around domestic violence. We see it with the LGBTQ space, and you have been at the forefront of having conversations with investors, across the country and around the world. And so it's not a conversation that we get to have very often with the people that we bring on Honest Conversations. Can you just talk a little bit about why you started thinking about this and how as individuals, you can ethically invest in organizations and schools, for instance, that invest in child safety?
Yeah, I mean, when I started Child Safety Pledge, initially I was focusing on philanthropists and thinking about how we invest our philanthropic dollars. So often donors are giving money altruistically to schools or camps or their alma mater. And, they often have a list of criteria that they ask. But one of the ones that I hadn't heard being discussed was, do you have protocols in place for child sexual abuse prevention and education? And so I spent years kind of on that circuit, attending multiple different conferences and speaking to philanthropists. I come from a philanthropic family. And it was interesting how often philanthropists viewed education and child sexual abuse as totally different areas. And I tried to explain to them, hey, if you're, investing your dollars, obviously you've thought a lot about this and you have all of these criteria in your grant making or in your investing for that matter. Have you thought about summer camps or schools as an environment where you can be proactive in protecting children? And it was very, very interesting over the years seeing the array of reactions. I met one very influential philanthropist who disclosed being a survivor in his 80s and said to me, I can't sign because I can't associate with this issue. It's something I've never talked about. And it was so fascinating to me how, that sometimes follows people over the years. But what was really interesting was, an outgrowth of working with philanthropists was looking at impact investing and looking at people who really look to align their investments with their values, whether that's with climate change, sustainability, gender issues, LGBTQ rights. And so there's actually an investor at Alliance Bernstein. His name is Eric Glass. He runs an impact portfolio. He's incredible. And he was investing, muni bonds in the Philadelphia, the Chicago school districts, and all across the country. And anyone who has investments in the stock market is, whether you realize it or not, typically investing in munis. And municipal bonds do, affect schools and school systems. And so he realized that in the Chicago public school system, there had been this massive, massive disclosure of child sexual abuse. It was so sad. I think it was in 2018. And he divested. He was the only investor in the country who pulled all of his investments out of that school district and started diligencing every single investment in every school district prior to every auction. And it was fascinating. And we spoke to investors across the country, and there was just a real fear about liability, about what happens if we do invest. There's no protocol for this. What happens if we do invest? Then there's a disclosure. But what was interesting was the fact that he diligenced, and we did this with your team at Darkness to Light. We helped inform his process. He was able to create some change within school districts who realized that if investors are asking these questions, we really need to figure this out, because it's going to affect the financial stability of our institution. So I would encourage anyone who's a philanthropist or an investor to talk to, whoever your recipients are, or where you're investing, and really have those conversations. Because I think the more people who engage and advocate for this issue, the more mainstream that will become, this conversation about prevention and how we can all play an active role.
There is so much to unpack in there, and we do not have enough time, but I think the one thing that I want to pull from what you just said is that leadership matters, right? And sometimes being the first, as the rabbi will tell you, can be a scary proposition, but can also have incredible impact. You think about Eric pulling his investment from the Chicago school system. How many kids does the Chicago school system, see every day, and how many are they responsible for? And if they now have increased protocols, better codes of conduct, increased, training for their administrators and their educators, that Eric's one move and that leadership changed an entire culture in the Chicago school systems. And so one person can have a massive impact when it comes to a financial donation and the connection between education and child safety. And I think polyvictimization, we talk a lot about child sexual abuse, but this matters for physical abuse, it matters for bullying, it matters for all sorts of things that children, fear. All right, so Debbie, we actually have a couple questions for you in the question and answer session. So the first one is from Lisa, and she says, Debbie, in your model, it takes a community to protect one child. Would it be safe to say the opposite would be true? If the community isn't intentional about protecting children, the environment is at risk.
Yes, and that is what we say. It also takes a community that allows abuse. And when we don't all play a role, then it does allow an environment where abuse can happen. So that's why within our community, the rabbis need to be aware, the administrators, the staff, the parents, community, everybody needs to be aware. And that is what can help prevent it. If people don't work together, if there's not a common knowledge, which is why when we use our program, we never go to children until all the adults have been gone through. All the adults have to be educated and have the same language. And then we go to the children and teach the children how to talk to their parents. But it does take a community. It takes a community awareness. It takes every parent. It takes staff. Staff, what we teach them mostly is, how do you know signs and symptoms of abuse? How do you bring up a question? How do you respond? How can a teacher play a role when they're the ones who see the children more time than anybody else? So everybody plays a role when keeping a community safe.
Agreed. I'm not sure. I'm going to open this up to everyone. The question is from Brenda Fowler. How do you communicate with parents or family members who believe that their child is tarnished, or that that there's been sin as a result of child sexual abuse? Rabbi, you look like you have an answer.
I'll jump into that one. So here in the state of Utah, we are very fortunate. The governor, actually, from the governor's office, has set up a bunch of working groups of interfaith clergy to tackle a lot of, the issues that plague society. And so one of the groups that I serve on is a group around child safety. And so one day I got this specific question, exactly what Brenda's asking, from a colleague of mine. How do you communicate to the children in your congregation that they're not tarnished by what you've gone through? Because I thought that, I thought I was tarnished. And so I turned to my colleague and I said, do you think they're tarnished? And he says, oh, heavens, no. So would you ever say that out loud? Would you ever address that verbally from the pulpit? And he says, I've never thought about it that way. And so I shared with him, most members of the clergy are also fundraisers. Most of us work for nonprofit organizations, and we need things from people as members of the clergy. I'm reminded of one of the stories that I was told right when I began my rabbinical career by someone who had been in the business for a very long time. And he told me that when he started out in the clerical space, in the rabbinic space, he got an appointment with a very big philanthropist in town. And he was trying to start off and make some money. And he goes to visit this guy and he makes him the whole pitch, the important work that he's doing. And he says, Joe, I need your help. And so Joe looks at the rabbi and says, Rabbi, I'm going to help you. And the rabbi's thinking to himself, oh, this is awesome. And Joe says, Rabbi, every time you make an event, I pledge that I will drive my 15-passenger van to the local senior center. I will pick up senior citizens, bring them to your event for free. I won't charge you anything. And I will bring them back after the event. So that way, all the seniors that want to attend your event will have a ride for free. This is how I'm going to help you, because I think you're doing remarkable work. And Joe looks at the rabbi and says, Rabbi, that's not the help you were referring to, right? And the rabbi said, no. And the lesson that he learned in that moment and then conveyed to me is that, when we need something, we convey it very directly. We know exactly what to say and how to say it. And so what I share with fellow members of the clergy is, if you don't believe that children who have been sexually abused are tarnished, get up on your pulpit and say as much, and don't leave it to vague unspecifics. Don't speak about everyone is beautiful in the eyes of God. Call it for what it is. Children who have gone through these sorts of experiences should bear no guilt, should bear no shame. They are not tarnished. They are not sinful. They are absolutely beautiful and wholesome in the eyes of God. And if that's what you really believe, call a spade, and get up there and say as much, because short of that, you leave kids to their anxieties and to their worst fears.
I think that was pretty clear, Brenda. I love that. I really do. Rabbi, we also had an individual talk a little bit about their experience in terms of the sort of judicial process, the comment you made about, it's not your fault for sending someone to jail. And I think their point was, there's also the opposite, that they believe that it's a cycle of violence and sending someone to jail. Maybe it's right that they pay for their sins in sort of the judicial legal process, but that sometimes it's a mental illness, and that there's a different ways of thinking about that. Have you ever had conversations with people about that?
So all the time. I think that a lot of people who hear my story, and my story does end, as I referenced earlier, with a guilty verdict and a jail sentence, and people think that I'm this tremendous advocate, that every perpetrator needs to burn, and the world will know no peace until that happens. And I understand that for countless survivors, the judicial system is just not for them. It's not something which they're interested in. For many of them, the re-traumatization that they go through in the court process is really not right for them. They are not in a healthy space for it. And many times, indeed, there is a reality of their perpetrator suffering with mental illness, in which case rehabilitation is absolutely the right call. In many instances, dealing with it internally does have the opportunity for a perpetrator to go to therapy and to really get the help they need, not to have it swept under the rug. But I guess the point that I'm making to the questioner is absolutely. There is a dime a dozen ways for people who do these sorts of things to children to get the help that they need. In many instances where there will be obstinance, where there will be defiance, where there will be denial, the only recourse that is left for victims is to pursue the justice system. I would say to the questioner that my abuser, having been convicted by a jury and having admitted on tape repeatedly to what has happened, still hasn't acknowledged what has happened. And so, in situations like that, sadly, the only recourse that our system has is incarceration, which I don't know that that's a good thing. And I don't know that that's a positive thing. The point that I'm trying to make is that a young person who's placed in a situation where that is the only option staring them in the face should not feel that guilt, and as was explained to me throughout the process, this is the decision of the district attorney of Salt Lake County to pursue justice, and you are but a small cog in the system. This is not you versus them. This is not you calling for blood or calling for vengeance. And so, if that's the decision that the district attorney makes, you go with that. But I would be the first to see firsthand how so many survivors of abuse sadly are the ones who end up perpetuating that cycle of violence. And in most instances, lengthy jail sentences are not what's called for. In the instances where it is, it's not on the survivor to feel that guilt.
Thank you for answering that honestly and holistically. I don't know, Rochel, or if you have anything that you want to add.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I've not really talked about it publicly, but I would say it's so personal, Avremi. I couldn't agree more. I think that sometimes there's an onus that's put on the survivor. Like, you have to come forward, you have to go through the system, and it is re-traumatizing. I know for myself, I'm a survivor, unfortunately, several times over, which is not uncommon. I think that's something a lot of people don't know. Once a child has been groomed and has been a survivor of child sexual abuse, it often is something that occurs again. Yeah. And when I was a teenager and it happened to me yet again, I actually dealt with it by making sure that the perpetrator got help. I followed up. I made sure that it didn't happen to anyone else, that he was in treatment, that he was really taking care of it. And it was a decision that I made because I couldn't really deal with it at that time in my life. And I did follow up years later, and thank God it wasn't something that, had reoccurred. But it was a very difficult decision going through that as a survivor and thinking, like, am I making a decision that could affect someone else? Am I, making the wrong choice? And also, I happened to have known his entire family, his grandparents, his parents, his siblings. And it was such a difficult, Avremi, what you described, really thinking I'm putting someone in jail. I wasn't really in a place where I felt that I could deal with that at that time in my life. I was young, I was living in another country, and it just wasn't something that I felt that I could handle. And I think that there needs to be that space for people to really find the right path for them and really acknowledging, how likely is this person to offend again.
Katelyn, can I make a comment? One of the things that I do that I think is really important, I think in that we all know that maybe the highest area or the fastest growing rate of sexual abuse is adolescents and younger. They are in many areas, the adolescents are with younger kids are the highest area of concern. Mm-hmm. I'd say within the Orthodox community, it is a very high area of concern. Is older siblings, older cousins, and that which occurs within the family, as it is in the rest of the world. But right. it is an area of high concern. One of the things that I stress in every parent workshop I give, I turn to the men in the room and I say, dads, this is for you. You need to have a conversation with your sons one-on-one. You need to sit down. You need to say it in a private and warm environment. Mm-hmm. You need to tell them that, sometimes boys have interests in girls, or they get curious, but they are never allowed to touch, look at, or talk about their sisters or their cousins or others' private areas of their body. And they're never allowed to ask them to touch or look or talk about their own. They're never allowed to do that. Now, you need to tell your sons, you know what? If that were to happen, or if you have a desire and you're struggling with it, you always need to come tell me. You won't be in trouble for telling me. I can get you some help. But you need to communicate with me. That if a father brings this up, the children know they can come back. And I can tell you that I had this incredible story, and I've had many, where a father told me that Friday night at 2 a.m, his son knocks on his door and he says, "Daddy, you told me I could come to you anytime." And the dad wakes up and he's like, "What? What did I say?" And oh my gosh. And then he gets up and he calmly goes into the den and he sits with his son in a dark room. And the son says, "Dad, I just touched my sister and it's not the first time." And the father said something fascinating. He said, "I remembered," he says, "your eyes were bearing into me saying, stay calm. No matter what they say, stay calm." He said, "With my right hand, I wanted to strangle him for violating my daughter. And with my left, I said, I love you, and I'm going to get you the help you need." And I think we have to have both of that. Fathers need to talk to their sons, and moms need to talk to their daughters. I'm just saying it's more,
Of course,
prevalent than it is. They need to have these discussions. Many of the Orthodox Jewish boys go to dorms. We need to have those discussions about what can happen in a dorm. And we need children to know they can go to their parents. We had a boy who came to his parents and said, "I go out and expose myself to older women." We need them to come to their parents, for the parents to be able to help and to deal with them.
Debbie, we had a number of reactions to that incredibly important story. And one of them is from Andrea Harner, who is asking about treatment for offenders, because she has read children can be rehabilitated, but studies often show that adult offenders don't respond well to treatment. What is your experience around rehabilitation, in addition to learning to continue to keep the dialogue open between children and their parents?
Are you talking about with adolescents or with adults?
Either.
My experience with adolescents there aren't enough programs for them.
Mm-hmm.
And we really do need more programs for kids, and we need more assessment. Was this a one-time thing that happened? Mm-hmm. Was this something that a child really has a pull to? Is this that we need more people who can assess adolescents, and who can help us determine what are we treating. I think that's important. And there are not enough adolescent programs. My understanding is treatment for adolescents is usually pretty effective, but there need to be more programs for adolescents. Mm-hmm. In terms of adults, I think what I have learned is it really depends on what type of a predator it is. Is it someone who's a sex addict? If it's a sex addict, then they get treated with an addiction model, and it's as effective as any other addiction model. And any other addiction, meaning some people do very well with addiction treatment. On the other hand, we all know there's relapses, high rate of relapses. Is it a pedophile? And someone who's a sex addict is not the same as a pedophile. Mm-hmm. If it's a pedophile, that's very difficult to treat. That takes tremendous supervision, mm-hmm. in addition to any treatment. And it's probably never going to be no treatment. It'll always have some level of supervision or responsibility related to it. Or is it someone who, we call it a preferential offender, someone who just, has an opportunistic kind of thing. Sometimes that's a brother and a sister Sometimes that's someone could be in a synagogue and go over to some girl and be inappropriate, or in different settings where someone is inappropriate, but it's an opportunistic.
Mm-hmm.
And that is usually treatable, and often, like Rochel, like you said, someone who does not offend again.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not all the same.
Right, right. Yeah, for those who are interested, Dr. Letourneau at Johns Hopkins is actually testing child focus or child age prevention training for those who seem to be interested in children who are younger than them. I think it's at the 6th grade level, if I'm not mistaken, and she's doing research around it. So crossing our fingers that we'll have some evidence-based training to be able to help with kids who are younger. I also think, and we're running out of time here, but the topic of pornography and the exposure of children to pornography we've seen a 10% increase overall in all communities of child-on-child sexual abuse. And you can't tell me that there is no correlation, or there isn't a correlation between access to the internet, children having phones, pornography, and the increase in child-on-child abuse. And these are kids who are curious and they're trying to understand what's happening to their bodies and why they feel the way they feel when they watch these things. So the unfortunate consequence of that experimentation is that the other child who is uninterested in experimenting lives with a lifetime of having been violated. So I think there is major conversations that we have to have around that. And so I will end on this question, also from Andrea Harmer, and thank you, Andrea. She's one of our board members, also based in LA, for watching today. So it's kind of a multiple part question. I'll read the whole thing, and then whoever would like to answer, please just jump in. So she asks, what do you propose is the best strategy for getting the Orthodox Jewish community to take systemic measures for prevention? Is it to get a group of rabbis to endorse education for parents? Is it to adopt a uniform code of conduct for all staff and administrators at yeshivas? Where is that systemic measure for prevention within the Orthodox Jewish community?
I mean, Avremi, I'd love to hear. Do you want to take it, and I'll follow you?
I want to hear what Debbie has to say, so we can all pass the buck over here. But so I think those are both very valuable ideas, but I think there's a crucial step that comes before it, and that is awareness. I firmly believe that the powers that be in the Orthodox communities, the rabbis and the community leaders who are running our yeshivas, both on the boys' side and on the girls' side, I'm going to be an optimist right now. I'm going to say that none of them are bad people, and none of them have blatant disregard about this issue because they don't care. I think that they have blatant disregard about this issue because they don't really know what it means, and they don't really begin to comprehend the effect that it has on kids who go through this. And I think that the first and foremost, most important thing that needs to happen are real, honest conversations with community leaders across the Jewish space, across any sort of, devout religious community. It's important for you to understand what happens to kids who go through this. If there was someone in these schools who was physically abusing kids, and kids were going home every day with a broken leg, I don't think that, community leaders would tolerate such behavior, because, hey, we can see the scarring, we can see the damage. And I think that the awareness and the education, which a lot of these leaders need, and to their credit, many of them are taking the steps to get, is to really understand the depths of this issue. When a child goes through this, what happens to them, the long-term effects on their behavior and their mental health. This is real. This is what is happening to kids under your watch. And undoubtedly, once you know that information, you will do what you can to make sure that doesn't continue. And you'll take the steps that Andrea enumerates, boards and codes of conduct, and having that sort of oversight. But I think that at its core, it begins with awareness. It really is imperative for people to understand what this does to people.
Agreed. Debbie, do you want to?
I totally agree. And I believe that awareness is really important. And I also agree that when you give them a point that you brought up before, when you give them a solution, when you give them a code of conduct, when you give them, this is what we do about it, they're much more likely to take it than when they don't know what to do with it. But I have found that there is a sensitivity. I will admit that part of what I really stress is liability. It's your liability. If Penn State could go down, you can go down. And it's your liability. So if I don't speak to the sensitivity part, then I do speak to the liability part. And that they are liable legally, they're liable emotionally to what happens, and they're liable spiritually to what happens to these kids. I think within the Orthodox community, another thing that I have found speaks to these administrators in schools is we have a very high degree of kids who have left the Orthodox fold. There's a very high percentage of the kids that have left the Orthodox fold have been sexually abused. We have to take responsibility for that. We have to do everything in our power to make sure it doesn't happen under our watch. And if it did, that those kids know we're there for them. Because these kids don't do well without religion. It's not that they're just not religious. They're going down deep, dark paths. And nobody wants that. So we got to take responsibility up front.
Yeah, there's a direct correlation between substance abuse and self-harm and untreated trauma from child abuse in general, not to mention child sexual abuse. So it's, you know, breaking away from a community that you've known your whole life, changing your entire lifestyle, and finding solace in substances that's temporary is an incredibly destructive path, although a very common path that many child sexual abuse survivors and victims, you know, deal with. Rochel, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, I've engaged in conversations about awareness for years, you know, all over the country and all over the world. And I think that what I would encourage everyone on this call and whoever you're talking to do is to have those conversations with, you know, anyone in your community who will listen, with your local community leaders, with other parents, with your family members. You know, it's also interesting to talk to parents and in-laws and hear their perspective and how they grew up and how you can create a proactive community where this conversation is normative. I think awareness, you know, like Avremi said, can't be stressed enough. I found from a liability perspective, whenever I've said that to institutions, then it becomes, and I agree with you, Debbie, that it's something that makes them listen and makes them sort of tune in. But then they're checking a box. And I think that what I would really love to see, you know, hopefully over the next few years, is this becoming culturally normative, where we just talk about this issue like we would, you know, smoke alarms, fire detectors. We wouldn't send our kids to a school or a summer camp that didn't have, you know, people who are trained in CPR and where we didn't know that there were protective measures in place. We shouldn't have, you know, synagogues and schools and camps, or even play dates where we aren't having conversations about supervision and ensuring that our kids are prepared. And like you said, that our kids come to us. So I think it's like this grassroots movement of all of us being advocates, of engaging with anyone within our immediate circle, and really growing that consciousness and awareness.
It's a beautiful place to end. I'm so honored and grateful. I had a really hard time cutting it off at 2 o'clock, so I appreciate everyone staying another 10 minutes, and especially to those participants. Thank you so much for those of you in the chat that shared your own personal stories of survivorhood. You know, we see you and we hear you, and we're so grateful that you're part of our community. Thank you so much to all of you for growing and learning and being open to listening to new and diverse thoughts in terms of the Orthodox Jewish community. For those of you who are facilitators and who are looking to speak to the new communities, particularly the Orthodox Jewish community, we will be sending out a recap email with all information from the organizations that we talked about today, access to Debbie's training. We'll make sure that you have access to the video itself, and we hope that you'll be sharing it with your communities and your networks as well, so that they can share in the knowledge that the Rabbi, Debbie, and Rochel brought us today. So Thank you to the three of you. I'm so grateful and honored to have had this chat today.